A long time ago, there were 3 guys in Rome who ruled the whole darn place. We know them today as the First Triumvirate, made up of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Now, Caesar was good at being a general. Pompey was a respected statesman and politician. But Crassus, well, he was pretty much the richest man in the history of the world. Okay, maybe that's debatable. But even if he wasn't the richest, he was certainly among the top few. I should say as rich as both Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos combined, if you count their total wealth, in land and slaves. Yeah, that's how the Roman aristocrats rolled. And Crassus wasn't just a money counter. Oh, no, he wanted some street cred. See, he started thinking that since he was so rich, he might as well go out and conquer some barbarians and get his name in lights. Now, where to find these barbarians? Easy. All you needed to do was look south of Anatolia towards the Middle East, and you would see the Parthian Empire, a bunch of nomadic horse lords from modern-day Iran. Perfect, Crassus would have a cakewalk. But Crassus didn't have an army. Time to change that. He raised a legion of 40,000 men, which sounds impressive, until you realize half of them were auxiliary troops. Not exactly elite soldiers. Still, not to worry, because most of the army was composed of experienced soldiers from the legions of Caesar's civil war, so it was still pretty solid. Besides, he'd be supporting them with the bulk of his cavalry wings. The legions would be backed by 6,000 cavalrymen and 2,000 more under the direct command of his son, Publius. That should be enough to mop up some horse-riding nomads, right? Time to set out across the Bosporus, make a quick victory, and come back to Rome before anyone realizes he has any strategic or tactical skill whatsoever. That's right. I said strategy and tactics. And, yeah, I know it was a joke, but I couldn't help myself. Now, the Triumvirate had decided to fight the Parthians because they weren't really doing anything, so why not? Plus, Crassus had personal ambitions to expand Rome's borders and gain glory. But there was a snag. The kingdom of Armenia was sandwiched between the two and was kind of getting in the way. So the Triumvirate asked King Artavasdes for permission to pass through his territory. But the king was playing for his own team and refused. So what did the Roman aristocrat do? He went to war. I mean, what else was new? And boy, was this a shock. As soon as Crassus crossed into Armenia, he got lost. Seriously, that's the best word for it. Crassus got utterly, completely lost. Most accounts say he didn't bring a map or an experienced guide, which makes you wonder if he actually knew where he was going. In fact, most accounts say he had no idea, but he kept marching forward, pushing his legions deeper into the Armenian highlands. Along the way, he engaged some Armenian forces, but those were easy to defeat. But as the Roman army pushed further into the mountains, everyone started getting very nervous. First, they had no idea where they were. Second, they had virtually no supplies. Third, they were starting to hear stories of the Parthians riding at them on horseback and picking them off one by one. Plus, the terrain was a nightmare. There was no water. It was freezing cold at night, and the Roman soldiers were having to trek over the mountains. Oh, and they were low on food. Not good. To top it all off, Crassus got sick. What are the odds? After 4 days of fighting and marching, Crassus collapsed, turned the command over to his son Publius, and retreated to a small town named Carrhae, hoping to regroup and figure out where the heck he was supposed to be. Now, you might think that with 40,000 men, a son, and not 1 but 2 cracks at winning glory, Crassus would have known better than to sit on his hands. But he didn't. Instead, he waited, he moped, and he sent messengers back to Rome, begging Caesar and Pompey to send him reinforcements. After all, this was their plan. But while he waited, the Parthians arrived. We don't know exactly who led them because the sources are a little sketchy. Some say it was King Orodes II, others that it was the royal general Surena. But it probably doesn't matter. Either way, they showed up with 9,000 horsemen and immediately set up camp outside the walls of Carrhae. Now you might think that Crassus would have immediately sent his cavalry out to engage the Parthians. But remember, His son Publius had already done that. And besides, he had no idea where the enemy was coming from, so he was afraid to commit his forces and get wiped out. So he played the waiting game. But as the Roman auxiliary troops patrolled the walls of Carrhae, the Parthians sent out their first message. It was simple. Lay down your arms and surrender the city, and we won't kill you. Or we could just lay siege to you until you starve to death. And Crassus considered it. I mean, the siege was already pretty dire. Supplies were low, people were starving, and the generals were afraid. What did they have to lose by surrendering? How bad could things get? And here's where we meet one of the most fascinating characters in the whole story, Roman historian Plutarch. Wait a minute, I thought you said Crassus was the richest man in Rome. Well, that's true, but he wasn't the smartest. Let me explain. You see, Crassus got fed up with Plutarch's whining and thought it was time to take action. So he recruited 10,000 of his toughest and hungriest troops and stormed out of the city to relieve the siege. Of course, the Parthians were waiting for him, and the Roman relief force got completely annihilated. Crassus barely escaped with his life, and that's putting it generously. According to Plutarch, out of 40,000 Roman troops, only 8,000 survived the battle. Rome lost almost half of her legions in the Battle of Carrhae, and it's a wonder she wasn't defeated in the east altogether. So, what happened? Well, according to Plutarch, Crassus had not done his homework. He hadn't prepared for battle. He hadn't trained his troops properly. He hadn't built a proper supply line. He hadn't coordinated with his allies. Basically, he had failed at every single aspect of campaigning. And to make matters worse, he had insulted the Armenians, whom he needed as allies, and he had chosen to fight the Parthians, one of the best cavalry armies in the ancient world. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But what about the Romans? Why did they lose? Well, according to Plutarch, they lost because they were arrogant. The Romans thought they were invincible, and they were used to fighting armies that relied on brute strength, not skill. But the Parthians were neither stupid nor weak. They were masters of horsemanship, archery, and tactics, and they had been fighting for centuries. They were tough, disciplined, and determined, and they were fighting for their homes and families. So, needless to say, the Romans were in trouble. Plutarch goes on to describe the horror that befell the Roman soldiers. First, they had to deal with the endless harassment of the Parthian horse archers. They were always there, raining arrows down on the Romans and then disappearing into the desert. Then they had to deal with the heat and the thirst. They had no water, and they couldn't move without it. Then they had to deal with the hunger and the cold. They had no food, and they couldn't stay warm without it. And finally, they had to deal with the fear and the uncertainty. They didn't know where they were going or what they were fighting for. They didn't know who their enemies were or what their tactics were. They didn't know how to win. And that is how the Roman army lost the Battle of Carrhae. But hey, at least they learned their lesson, right? Never trust a rich guy with a small army and a big ego. It never ends well. Thanks for watching.